Programme looks at the rising price of improvements and renovations. In home makeovers, the true cost at 7:30. Now let's catch up on today's stories in the Lunchtime News.
A record number of COVID pings as bosses of essential services clamour for their workers to be exempt from isolation rules. From trains to supermarkets, staff shortages in some places are at their highest since the pandemic began.
The government says that it wants to make sure that critical services can function. Well, Iceland is a critical service and we're struggling to function at the moment.
After the government had said there won't be a list of exemptions, today a minister said there will be one, causing more confusion over government policy for critical workers. Also ahead. The inquest into the Croydon tram crash says the 7 victims were not unlawfully killed. More trouble in Tokyo the day before the Olympic opening ceremony. The show's director is sacked. And will he ever find his mum, the orphaned orca being cared for by humans?
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Nina Hossain.
Good afternoon. The number of people getting pinged by the COVID app has hit a record high. More than 600,000 alerts were sent in England and Wales last week. Some businesses, including supermarkets, are calling for their staff to be allowed to test daily instead of isolating to keep the country running if they've been double jabbed. A government minister said today a list of critical workers who will be exempt will be published later, just days after saying there would be no list. The pinging confusion continues. Our political reporter Shihab Khan has the latest.
The week began with so-called Freedom Day, but now as the numbers of people self-isolating continues to rise, it is ending with significant disruption. With so many off work, there have been delays to emergency services, transport and even bin collections. Staff shortages have meant some supermarket shelves are looking scarce. And Iceland, which was forced to close some shops, is now hiring 2,000 temporary workers just to get by.
The government says that it wants to make sure that critical services can function. Well, Iceland is a critical service and we're struggling to function at the moment. So that's why we need clarity, and we need key worker exemption for retail workers, but also HGV drivers.
Ministers are working on a list, which is expected later today, of industries that will be exempt from COVID isolation. But who will be on it?
I'm not going to tell you now. I mean, this is not. I'm never ever going to preempt a publication and what we're announcing in a written document on a television programme.
That's fine, but we've had these warnings for days and days now. Why do you wait for something to become a huge problem before fixing? Why not act in advance?
So we are, as I said, looking at the situation. We set up very clear rules about self-isolation if pinged. I am absolutely focused on dealing with issues as they arise. I think we've got a very clear set of rules and we think they should be followed.
The urgency to act is because in the week up to July 14th, more than 250,000 people tested positive for COVID, up 33% from the week before. In that same period, more than 618,000 people were pinged on the app and told to self-isolate. The rules about staying at home will be in place until the 16th of August, something that this former health secretary thinks is a bad idea.
Does he not think it's time for the government to listen to public opinion and scrap the 10-day isolation requirement immediately for people who are pinged who have been double jabbed?
We know that our most effective tool is the vaccination programme, but the second most effective tool is self-isolation. What we are attempting to do is transition this virus from pandemic to endemic status. If you allow all these things to happen too rapidly and people then decide not to self-isolate, then I think you run the risk of infection rates running away with us.
But nonetheless, pressure is mounting on the government, particularly from struggling businesses, for the isolation system to be changed sooner rather than later. Shihab Khan, ITV News, Westminster.
So today a minister said they'll announce a list of critical workers who don't have to isolate after the government said just days ago there wouldn't be a list. Let's find out why from our political correspondent Libby Vina. What's going on? What's changed?
Well, back on Monday, the Prime Minister did promise that certain critical workers, as he called them, would be exempt from having to self-isolate if they'd been double vaccinated. It's now Thursday and we're still waiting to hear who will be involved in that system and how it will work. Kwasi Kwarteng earlier was suggesting that individual companies wouldn't have to apply for their workers to be exempt. But the Number 10 spokesman told journalists a short time ago that it would work with individual firms having to make applications to various government departments. So essentially, we're none the wiser this lunchtime. We're waiting for a list to be produced this afternoon, which will explain which particular sectors could have workers exempted from self-isolation, but we still don't know how that system will work.
Yeah, we saw the vaccines minister in Shihab's report there. He also today in the Commons called for 18 to 29-year-olds to get their COVID jab.
Yes, I think there is huge concern in government about the low take-up by young people. Something like a third haven't had either vaccine, the first or second dose, and that is worrying ministers. I think it is behind this idea that come the autumn, there will have to be vaccine passports for people going into nightclubs, although the vaccines minister did squash the idea that this would be extended to include, for example, public buildings or schools. But the government is very focused on trying to restrict entry to nightclubs. They believe that will be a big incentive to young people to get vaccinated. The question is, though, will the government be able to get this legislation through Parliament? Labour has indicated they're not in favour of it, and I think the government would be very reluctant to go down the road of testing this in Parliament without knowing it had a majority to get it through.
Libby Vina, thank you very much. Thank you. The 7 people who died when the driver of a tram fell asleep at the wheel were not unlawfully killed. That is the conclusion of the inquest into their deaths after the crash in Croydon nearly 5 years ago. The driver was almost 4 times over the speeding limit when the tram spun off the tracks on a sharp bend. Sejal Karia has the details of and reaction to today's verdict.
It began as an ordinary early morning commute to work. It ended in tragedy with 7 lives lost. The worst tram crash in Britain in a century. 6 men and 1 woman died that morning. They left home in South London and never returned. More than 4.5 years later, an inquest jury today concluded they died as a result of an accident and weren't unlawfully killed. Their families branded the inquest a farce, saying the driver, Transport for London and the tram operators should have been called to give evidence.
Let down, heartbroken, devastated, all over again. The driver is the only person that knows why my dad isn't here. I have a 3-year-old daughter that will never meet her grandfather because of this accident.
This reconstruction shows the tram hitting a sharp bend at 73 kilometres per hour in a 20 kilometre per hour zone, almost 4 times the speed limit, causing it to topple over and spin off the tracks. The accident happened at this junction close to the Sandylands tram stop in Croydon. Crash investigators said it was fast and violent and that passengers were thrown out of the tram, and it was over in just a matter of seconds. This footage shows a tram on the same stretch taking the bend in question. Note how slowly it takes the corner. But on the day of the crash, it was going too fast. There was no automated braking to slow it down. The jury concluded the driver lost awareness after becoming disorientated and may have briefly fallen asleep. He was never charged, but concerns over driver fatigue due to shift patterns had been raised 3 years earlier. And this wasn't the first time trams had been speeding round this bend. The most recent just days before this tragedy. The jury criticised a culture at Trams Operations Limited that stopped drivers reporting safety concerns.
For this tragedy, justice has been suffocated, and instead of providing long-awaited answers, the families have been put through more agony. Ultimately, they feel that nobody has been held accountable for their loved ones' deaths.
The families of those who died are angry that no one is taking the blame, the responsibility for the 7 lives lost that fateful day. They will now press for a fresh inquest. Sejal Karia, ITV News.
The funeral of the murdered police and community support officer Julia James has taken place at Canterbury Cathedral. People lined the streets to pay tribute to the 53-year-old, while her former colleagues formed a guard of honour outside the station she worked at. Julia was found dead in a Kent wood in April. She'd been out walking her dog near her home. A 21-year-old has been charged with her murder. The man in charge of putting on one of the greatest shows on earth, the Olympic opening ceremony, has been sacked with less than 24 hours to go before it starts. The show's director, Kentaro Kobayashi, was fired after a video emerged of him making jokes about the Holocaust. He's not the first to have left a key role at the Tokyo Games, an Olympics that has been cursed with problems. Our sports editor Steve Scott is there and just sent this update.
Well, of course, since the pandemic, these games have been controversial and have faced challenges at every single turn. Only yesterday, the musical director for the opening ceremony tomorrow quit, and today, the main director was actually sacked for comments he made about the Holocaust 23 years ago. As for the ceremony itself, well, of course, it's going to be very scaled back. There's going to be no mass choreography, and there'll be fewer athletes inside. There'll be no spectators too, and even some of the invited guests have decided not to show up, even those with strong relationships with the Olympics. Big sponsors like Toyota, their boss isn't going to be there. He's decided, after deciding not to put television ads on relating to the Olympics during these games, he's decided not to show up to the opening ceremony at all, and that gives you an indication of the public sentiment in Japan. The most recent poll said that 2/3 of this country still did not believe that the organisers could control a spread of COVID that would be inevitable because of these games. And we haven't even talked about the sport itself. It's very difficult to know how that's going to look, apart from the fact we know there are going to be no spectators at any of the events. But could some big names be forced to pull out? COVID infections have been pretty low amongst athletes so far, but we don't know where that's going to go. Could there be a case where whole teams have to withdraw? And then you start questioning the integrity of the games themselves. I think standing here today, it's very difficult to be confident and say that we've got this far, so in 3 weeks' time, we'll be sitting back and saying those games were a great success, and it was just what the world needed at this time.
Steve Scott reporting there from Tokyo. Still to come this lunchtime. How to keep rugby and other sports safe. We'll ask a World Cup winner and the daughter of an England football hero. And the baby killer whale saved from certain death but lost from its mother in New Zealand. But first, the inquiry into the terror attack at the Manchester Arena has heard evidence from the survivor who was closest to the bomber when he detonated his device. Martin Hibbert and his daughter Eve were among hundreds who were injured. Today, he described how they both had to wait hours to receive proper treatment. Hannah Miller is at the inquiry. Hannah, what did Mr. Hibbert have to say?
Well, Martin Hibbert was just 6 metres away when the bomb went off. He himself said it beggars belief that he survived. As he spoke to the inquiry today, he spoke for the first time about his daughter Eve, who back then was 14. They'd gone, he said, on a daddy-daughter night out, but it ended in him watching as she was being covered with T-shirts and posters because people thought that she was dead. He said that in that moment he felt he had one duty, which was to save her life. Ultimately, it was nearly 2 hours before the emergency services were able to take them to hospital. This is what he said happened in the moments before the paramedic came to save his life.
They didn't have the right equipment, but I could feel that, I could sense that with everything else that was going on. Do you know what I mean? And it was to go through that, to know that you're dying, and to be left alone, and to know that nobody's coming, and that you're not getting the right help and support. It's an awful thing to go through.
Eve was in hospital for 10 months. Her father, Martin, says she's the only person in the world to survive injuries like those that she had. This inquiry has different phases. It will hear from 2 more survivors this afternoon who want to talk about that response from the emergency services. They had to fight to be allowed to be heard here, and it's clear that among the individual acts that saved their lives, they also want to talk about why the emergency response took so long.
Hannah Miller, thank you very much. Campaigners have welcomed a parliamentary report which says urgent action is needed to address a long-term failure to reduce the risks of brain injury in sport. It was published after a 4-month inquiry by the Department for Sport and called for sporting bodies and the government to do more. So how common are brain injuries in sport? Well, new figures out today from the Drake Foundation show nearly a quarter of elite adult rugby players suffered from brain abnormalities, and half showed an unexpected change in brain volume due to impacts to the head. These findings come almost 20 years after a court ruled that the dementia suffered by the former West Brom footballer Jeff Astle was entirely consistent with heading a ball. He died at the age of 59. His daughter Dawn Astle joins me now, as does the former Saracens and World Cup winning rugby player Kieran Bracken, who himself has suffered head injuries and now campaigns for safer sport. Welcome both. Good afternoon to you. Kieran, given those figures, given what happened to you, what action do you want to see taken and by who?
Well, there was a lobby group of ex-players, doctors, teachers, well-meaning people who set up Progressive Rugby in light of the recent claims, the legal claims, concerned about the game of rugby and the way it's going in relation to concussion. Now, in rugby, concussion is the #1 injury in the sport, so it's an endemic problem in the sport. So we've been lobbying for some time to get change, and it's great that the DCMS committee tackle this problem, and so, some damning reports from the committee saying that there's been a really lack of investment and a real lack of faith in the organisers of doing the right thing. From our point of view, we have a scenario now, and you may notice that Luke Cowan-Dickey, the Lions player, a few weeks ago got knocked out on a pitch, unconscious. He's on the floor unconscious, and yet somehow a week later he's allowed to take the field. And we think this is catastrophic for his future health and anyone else who's following that example. So we've been campaigning at Progressive Rugby for change, which is what is needed. And World Rugby have come out with a 6-point strategy, as has the RFU in the last few days, to tackle player welfare. But the elephant in the room of the HIA return to play is not fit for purpose, and I cannot believe that is not being tackled. But hopefully the Health and Safety Executive and UK Sport will make change.
OK, let's turn to Dawn now, and let's turn to football and very similar scenes. Watching so much of the Euros, you see so many headers and you see players colliding, hitting their heads. That's really commonplace. What change do you want to see in football at any level, especially as Kieran was talking about there, when you've seen a player go down and then get up quite quickly and get back to the pitch, or even after some time get back to the pitch, which isn't what is necessarily advised medically?
Hi, good afternoon. I think the main thing, and one thing that we're very grateful that the committee has highlighted, is the Health and Safety Executive is responsible by law, and it seems to have delegated risk management to the governing bodies, and the committee said it was a dereliction of duty, which must be changed. And football, is a much loved sport for millions of people around the world, myself included, but for my dad and for other professionals, it's just their job, and they should be afforded the same protection from known risks as anybody else in any other job. And I find it astounding that health and safety doesn't involve football. There are independent research papers by an eminent professor back in 1995 and 1997 saying that sports workers have the same rights as other workers. So it's been supported by experts, but it's now 2021 and still no one has done anything about that.
Kieran, if I can bring you in finally, while you are both waiting for change, what would you advise younger players in terms of taking care of their own health in this situation if they have a collision?
Yes, well, rugby is a contact sport and you're never going to get away from that. And it is a fantastic sport. But young kids who are watching the likes of Luke Cowan-Dickey, do not follow that example. Take the appropriate time off and go seek proper doctor's medical care if you do have a head injury, and don't go back on the pitch, which is very, very dangerous.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it, when you're in the height of the game and wanting to continue your sport. But sage advice there. Kieran and Dawn, thank you very much for joining me this lunchtime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Finally, a real-life Finding Nemo story with a few plot changes. It involves a baby whale. He's not lost like in the film, but he desperately needs to find his mum. The search is on in New Zealand, where the orphaned orca has become a bit of a celebrity. Sangeeta Lal on a nation hoping for a happy ending.
It's a race against time for a family reunion like no other. Little Tor is less than 6 months old. He's lost and needs his mother. They became separated after he swam into rocks nearby and got stuck. And although quickly freed, volunteers know if he's released without his family, Tor won't survive. He still depends on his mother's milk, and the team know he needs a feed. Overnight, the operation began to get him into a temporary home. Luckily, he moved in just in time for dinner.
He's doing really, really well. He just had a feed a couple of hours ago, and we had little squeals of excitement when the warm formula hit his tummy.
Now stable, Tor has quickly stolen the nation's hearts, the whole of New Zealand willing him to find his family. Although he's doing well, Tor isn't completely safe yet.
A little bit of a knife edge here, wild animal and natural environment, through some trauma. We'll just need to keep monitoring.
While the team here do that, others are out searching either for his mother or a surrogate who could welcome Tor into their pod and raise him as their own. Sangeeta Lal, ITV News.
That's where we'll leave it for now. Charlene's here at 6:30. Whatever you're doing, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.